Before there were gods, before there was sky, before there was even a name for the darkness that surrounded everything, there was only silence. No sun, no sea, no mountains rising against a horizon because there was no horizon to rise against. There was only a vast, formless gap, stretching in every direction and in no direction at all, a place the earliest Greek poets would one day call chaos. Not chaos in the way we use the word now, not disorder or noise, but something older and stranger than that. A yawning emptiness, a space waiting to become something. And out of that emptiness, the first shapes began to form. Why did anything come from nothing at all? Why did a being like Gaia, the earth herself, rise up out of the void with no one to give her that shape? The Greeks never fully answered that question, and in a strange way, that unanswered mystery is part of why these stories have survived for nearly 3,000 years. This is a story about power, about fathers destroying sons and sons destroying fathers, about a prophecy that could not be escaped no matter how carefully anyone tried to outrun it. It is the story of a boy hidden in a cave on a mountain in Crete, raised in secret so that his own father would not devour him the way he had devoured his brothers and sisters. That boy would grow up to overthrow the very order of the universe, and he would become the king of every god who ever sat on Olympus. This is the story of Zeus. To understand him, you first have to understand the world he was born into, a world without kindness, without mercy, where the strong ruled simply because they were strong, and where every ruler eventually feared the one thing that had made him a ruler in the first place. The next generation, waiting in the dark, ready to take his place. Think for a moment about what it means to rule an entire universe that has never once known justice. No courts existed yet to settle disputes among gods. No laws had been written to protect the weak from the strong, the child from the parent, the guest from the host who might wish him harm. Every question of right and wrong, at the very dawn of everything, was answered the same way it had always been answered among the earliest and most powerful beings in existence, through sheer force, and through whichever god or titan happened to be holding the largest weapon at the time. Zeus would eventually become the one who imposed order onto that chaos, who gave shape to concepts like justice, hospitality, and sworn oaths that still echo through language and law today. But he would do so only after first proving himself capable of exactly the kind of violence that had defined every ruler before him. The shape of nothing according to the oldest Greek traditions, gathered centuries later by the poet Hesiod, the universe did not begin with light. It began with chaos, and shortly after, 4 other primordial forces emerged alongside it, seemingly on their own, without parents or explanation. There was Gaia, the earth, broad-breasted and eternal, the foundation upon which everything else would eventually stand. There was Tartarus, a bottomless pit far beneath the earth, a place so deep that a bronze anvil dropped from the surface would fall for 9 full days before it ever reached the bottom. There was Eros, the force of desire and attraction, the pull that would one day draw gods and mortals alike into love, obsession, and disaster. And there was Nyx, the night dark and quiet, who alone in this primordial family would go on to give birth to some of the most feared beings in the entire mythology, death, sleep, and the fates who measured out the length of every life that would ever be lived. From chaos also came Erebus, the personification of darkness, and together Erebus and Nyx would produce Aethna, the shining upper air, and Hemera, the day itself. Even at the very beginning, the pattern was already forming. Darkness gives birth to light. One generation creates the very thing that will eventually replace it. Gaia, alone and without a partner, brought forth Uranus, the starry sky, vast enough to stretch across her entire body and cover her completely. She also created the mountains and Pontus, the sea. And then, in an act that ancient poets described almost matter-of-factly, Gaia and her own son Uranus became partners, and from their union came the first true generation of divine children, a race of enormous and powerful beings known as the Titans. There were 12 of them in the earliest tradition, 6 sons and 6 daughters. Oceanus and Tethys, who ruled the great river believed to encircle the entire world. Hyperion and Theia, whose children would one day become the sun, the moon, and the dawn. Coeus and Phoebe, ancestors of Leto, whose fate would one day intertwine directly with Zeus himself. Creus, Iapetus, whose sons would include the Titan who dared to steal fire for humanity. Mnemosyne, memory itself, who would later lie with Zeus and give birth to the 9 muses. Themis, the embodiment of divine law and order, who would also become one of Zeus's most important partners. And finally, the youngest and most ambitious of them all, a Titan named Cronus, and his sister Rhea. But Gaia and Uranus did not stop there. They also produced the Cyclopes, 3 enormous one-eyed beings named Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, each one a master forger capable of crafting weapons no other being could create. And after them came the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers so massive and so strange that each possessed 50 heads and 100 powerful arms. It was here, with these final children, that the first great crime in the history of the universe took place. Uranus looked upon the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones and felt something that would echo through nearly every generation of gods that followed him: fear. Fear of his own children. Fear that their strength might one day be turned against him. So Uranus did the unthinkable. He forced them back down into the body of their own mother, sealing them deep within Gaia, in the crushing darkness of the earth itself, in a place that some traditions link directly to Tartarus. Gaia endured this in agony, the enormous weight of her own children pressing endlessly inside her, and her grief slowly hardened into something else entirely. A plan. A plan for revenge, carried out through the one group of children Uranus had not yet imprisoned, the Titans. The fall of the sky Gaia forged a great sickle out of a hard gray stone often described as adamant, nearly indestructible, and she went to her Titan children, begging one of them to help her strike back against their father. Most of them, terrified of Uranus's power, refused, but one did not. Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, took the sickle from his mother's hands. That night, when Uranus descended to lie once more with Gaia, Cronus was waiting in the shadows. He struck, cutting his own father in a single brutal motion, and Uranus's power was severed from him forever. Some drops of his blood fell upon the earth and gave rise to new beings, including the Erinyes, the Furies, spirits of vengeance who would one day pursue mortals guilty of the deepest crimes, especially crimes committed against one's own family. Other traditions say that where the remains touched the sea, a new goddess rose fully formed from the foam, Aphrodite, born not from union but from violence, carrying within her very origin the strange mixture of beauty and danger that would define her for the rest of mythology. Uranus, defeated, withdrew from the world, cursing his children as he departed, warning them that they too would one day suffer the same fate at the hands of their own offspring. It was a curse the Titans did not take seriously enough. It was a curse Cronus, above all of them, should have remembered. With Uranus gone, Cronus became ruler of the cosmos, and Rhea, his sister, became his queen. For a time, the world under Cronus was remembered by later poets as a golden age, a period of peace and abundance where humans, freshly created, lived without hardship, without labor, without war, and without the slow decline of old age. The Titans ruled the heavens, the earth flourished, and it seemed as though the era of divine violence had finally come to an end. But Cronus had not freed his imprisoned siblings, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones. He left them buried in Tartarus, just as his father had. And more importantly, Cronus had never forgotten his father's final warning. A father who devoured his children, both Gaia and Uranus, according to the old traditions, had prophesied that Cronus himself would eventually be overthrown by one of his own children, just as he had overthrown his own father. Rather than accept this fate or attempt to prevent it through some act of wisdom, Cronus chose the same solution his father had reached for, only darker and more permanent. As Rhea bore him children, one after another, Cronus swallowed each of them whole the moment they were born. First came Hestia, goddess of the hearth, then Demeter, who would one day govern the harvest and the seasons, then Hera, who would become queen of Olympus, then Hades, the eldest son, who would one day rule the dead, then Poseidon, lord of the restless sea. Each child, moments after entering the world, disappeared down their father's throat, imprisoned alive within his body, conscious and utterly powerless to escape. Rhea watched this happen 5 times. 5 children taken from her within moments of their birth. The grief this caused her is described in the old poems with real tenderness, an early acknowledgement, even within a story ruled almost entirely by gods and monsters, that a mother's suffering mattered. When Rhea became pregnant for the 6th time, she resolved that this child would survive. She went to her own parents, Gaia and Uranus, for help, and together they devised a plan. Rhea traveled in secret to the island of Crete, to a cave on Mount Ida, or in some versions Mount Dicte, hidden deep within the wild landscape of the island, far from Cronus's watchful eyes. There she gave birth to a son. She named him Zeus. Rather than bring the newborn back to Cronus, Rhea wrapped a large stone in swaddling cloth, disguising it to resemble an infant, and presented it to her husband. Cronus, suspecting nothing, swallowed the stone whole, believing he had consumed his 6th child just as he had the previous 5. Zeus, meanwhile, was carried away into hiding. A childhood hidden from the world, the infant god was entrusted to the care of nymphs, and in the most widely told version of the myth, he was nursed by a goat, or a goat nymph, named Amalthea, whose milk sustained him through his earliest days on Crete. To ensure that Cronus would never hear the cries of his hidden son and grow suspicious, a group of armored guardians known as the Curetes danced around the cave entrance, clashing their spears against their shields, drowning out any sound that might otherwise carry across the mountainside and reach the ears of the king of the Titans. It is worth imagining, for a moment, what that childhood must have actually looked like, stripped of its later grandeur. A cave on a mountainside, cool and dim, even in the heat of a Cretan summer, the smell of wild herbs drifting in on the wind, the distant clash of bronze spears against bronze shields echoing whenever the infant's cries grew too loud. No golden throne, no adoring worshippers, no thunderbolt yet resting in his small hands. Just a hidden child, guarded by nymphs and armed dancers, growing up entirely outside the world he would one day rule, learning nothing yet of Olympus, knowing only the goat who fed him, the cave that sheltered him, and the constant, unspoken tension of a secret that could never be allowed to slip. Later tradition even claimed that a broken tusk from Amalthea became the original cornucopia, the horn of plenty, endlessly overflowing with fruit and grain, Zeus's first recorded act of gratitude toward a creature that had shown him kindness before he had any power at all to repay it. Zeus grew up in secrecy, on a remote island, protected by nymphs and armored dancers, entirely unaware, for a time, of the war that his very existence had already set into motion. He was not raised on Olympus. He was not raised among gods at all in the traditional sense. He was raised in hiding, the way a fugitive might be raised, because the truth was that he was one, a hidden heir waiting. As he grew into adulthood, the stories describe a young god of remarkable strength, intelligence, and ambition, though even at this early stage his character carried the complexity that would define his entire reign. He was not simply good. He was not simply just. He was capable from the very beginning of both extraordinary generosity and extraordinary ruthlessness, and both of these qualities would shape the world he was about to create. Eventually, guided by Gaia, and in some traditions assisted by a clever titan named Medes, whose name literally meant wisdom, Zeus made his way back toward his father's court, no longer a hidden infant, but a grown god with a plan of his own. The poison and the rebellion Medes prepared a potion, and according to the most enduring version of the myth, she helped Zeus disguise himself as a cupbearer in Cronus's household, allowing him to slip the mixture into his father's drink. It is easy to imagine the scene. A young stranger admitted quietly into the halls where Cronus still ruled unaware, offering wine at a feast the old king had no reason to distrust, the same casual hospitality that had allowed so many of these ancient stories to turn on a single unguarded moment of trust. Whatever the exact method, the result was the same. Cronus was forced to vomit up everything he had swallowed over the years, beginning, remarkably, with the stone that had once been disguised as Zeus himself, a stone that would later be placed at Delphi as a sacred relic and marker of the world's center. Then came the children. One by one, fully grown despite having spent years trapped inside their father's body, Zeus's siblings emerged. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. Each of them stepped back into the world as adults, robbed of their childhoods entirely, and each of them immediately understood exactly who was responsible for their long imprisonment, and exactly who had just freed them. There is something quietly remarkable in this detail that later poets rarely dwelt on directly, that 5 grown gods, each carrying years of consciousness spent trapped in total darkness inside their father's body, aware the entire time of the world continuing without them, now stood blinking in the daylight for the very first time, owing their freedom entirely to the youngest sibling they had never even had the chance to meet. Zeus had gained 5 siblings, 5 allies, and an enormous debt of loyalty in a single, carefully executed act. But freeing his brothers and sisters was only the beginning. Cronus was not going to relinquish power without a fight, and neither were the Titans who remained loyal to him. What followed was a conflict so massive that later poets described it as shaking the very foundations of the earth. A 10-year war for control of the entire universe, remembered ever since as the Titanomachy. The war for the heavens. Zeus and his siblings established themselves on Mount Olympus, and from there, the war against Cronus and the Titans began in earnest. For years, the conflict remained locked in a brutal stalemate. The Titans were ancient, powerful, and immovable, and Cronus commanded them with the same ruthlessness that had defined his entire reign. It was Gaia who once again tipped the balance, just as she had done when she armed Cronus against his own father generations before. She counseled Zeus to free the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones, his own uncles, still trapped in the crushing darkness of Tartarus after countless generations of imprisonment, first by Uranus and then by Cronus, who had never bothered to release them either. Zeus descended into Tartarus and freed them. The Cyclopes, grateful beyond measure, immediately set to work using their extraordinary skill as smiths, and they forged gifts for their 3 liberators that would become some of the most iconic weapons in all of mythology. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt, a weapon capable of striking with the raw power of the sky itself. For Poseidon, they forged the trident, capable of shaking the earth and stirring the sea into violent storms. For Hades, they crafted a helmet of invisibility, allowing its wearer to move unseen even among gods. The 100-handed ones, meanwhile, threw themselves into battle alongside Zeus's forces, hurling massive boulders with their many arms in numbers the Titans simply could not withstand. With Cyclopean weapons in hand and the 100-handed ones fighting at his side, Zeus turned the tide of the war decisively. The poet Hesiod, describing this war generations later, wrote of a struggle so vast that the boundless sea roared terribly around the combatants, and the earth crashed loudly, and the wide sky groaned as it was shaken, and tall Olympus reeled from its foundation under the charge of the immortals, a heavy quaking reaching all the way down to dim Tartarus from the trampling of feet and the force of the pursuit. Thunderbolt after thunderbolt flew from Zeus's hand in an unbroken stream, so numerous and so fierce that the flame from the lightning was said to scorch even the fertile earth around them, the vast forests crackling loudly with fire, the heat so intense that it seemed, to those ancient poets, to boil the sea itself. Amid this devastation, the 100-handed ones proved decisive. Each of the 3 brothers, hurling boulders with 50 pairs of arms at once, sent an unrelenting hail of stone down upon the Titan ranks, 300 rocks flying in a single volley, burying enemy after enemy beneath an avalanche of earth, even as Zeus's thunderbolt scorched the sky above them. The Titans, ancient and powerful as they were, had never faced an assault of this scale, and their lines finally broke. Mountains were said to have been ripped from the ground and hurled like stones. The noise alone was described as reaching all the way down to Tartarus and echoing back up again. In the end, the Titans were defeated. Most of them, including Cronus himself, were bound and cast down into Tartarus, sealed behind gates of bronze, guarded eternally by the very hundred-handed ones who had helped defeat them. The age of the Titans had ended. The age of the Olympians had begun. Dividing the world with Cronus overthrown and the Titans imprisoned, Zeus and his brothers faced a new question, one that would define the political structure of the entire Greek cosmos for generations to come. How should the universe now be divided? According to the most common tradition, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, drew lots to determine which domain each of them would rule. Zeus received the sky, and with it, ultimate authority over gods and mortals alike. Poseidon received the sea, along with the power to summon storms, earthquakes, and floods whenever his temper demanded it. Hades received the underworld, the vast and shadowed realm of the dead, a domain that few gods and even fewer mortals ever wished to enter voluntarily. It is worth pausing on how differently each brother came to feel about the outcome of that draw. Poseidon accepted his portion with a restlessness that never quite settled, forever prone to petty grievances over slights both real and imagined, quick to summon storms against sailors who displeased him, and just as quick to flood the fields of kings who had failed to honor him properly. Hades, by contrast, seemed to accept his lot with something closer to quiet resignation, retreating to his shadowed kingdom, and rarely venturing back up into the light of Olympus at all. So rarely, in fact, that later Greeks sometimes referred to him simply as the Unseen One, a ruler mentioned more often than he was actually shown, present in nearly every myth concerning death, and yet almost entirely absent from the day-to-day dramas that consumed his siblings above. Zeus, receiving what many would consider the finest portion of the three, the open sky and ultimate authority over the entire cosmos, carried that authority with a confidence neither of his brothers ever quite matched, though the ancient sources are careful to note that his rule was not, strictly speaking, absolute tyranny. He remained bound by the same fundamental laws that governed the universe itself, the decrees of fate spun out by the Moirai, the ancient rights of Gaia as the primordial earth, and the accumulated weight of oaths and precedent that even a king of the gods could not simply wave aside whenever convenient. This tension between Zeus's practical supremacy and the deeper cosmic order he could bend but never entirely break would surface again and again throughout the mythology, most powerfully in his grief over Sarpedon, and in the prophecy concerning Medes that had once driven him to swallow her whole rather than risk losing his throne exactly as his own father once had. The earth itself, along with Olympus, was considered common ground, shared among them, though it was Zeus who would ultimately assume the role of supreme ruler over both gods and men, seated upon Olympus in a position that his brothers, however powerful in their own right, would come to acknowledge, sometimes reluctantly, as final and absolute. Not every Titan had opposed Zeus during the war. Some, particularly a Titan named Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, had seen the coming defeat clearly and chosen to side with the Olympians instead of his own kind. This decision would later place Prometheus in an extraordinary position, trusted enough by Zeus to be given responsibilities in the shaping of the new world, yet still fundamentally sympathetic to the suffering of mortals, in a way that would eventually bring him into direct and devastating conflict with the very king he had once supported. But before that conflict could unfold, Zeus faced one final monstrous threat to his newly won throne, one that Gaia herself, still resentful over the imprisonment of her Titan children, was said to have set into motion. Typhon, the final terror Gaia, angered that Zeus had confined so many of her Titan offspring to Tartarus, mated with Tartarus itself, the primordial pit, and gave birth to a creature unlike anything that had come before, a monster named Typhon. Typhon was described as being so enormous that his head brushed against the stars, with 100 serpent heads erupting from his shoulders, eyes that blazed with fire, and a voice that could shift between the roar of a bull, the howl of a lion, and the hiss of countless snakes, sometimes all at once. Fire poured from his eyes as he moved, and where his hands reached, mountains themselves were said to shudder. He was, quite simply, the most terrifying creature the young cosmos had yet produced, and his purpose, according to the old traditions, was singular: to destroy Zeus and end the reign of the Olympians before it had properly begun. When Typhon rose to attack Olympus, the other gods, according to some versions of the myth, fled in terror, transforming themselves into animals and scattering across Egypt to escape his wrath. Zeus alone stood his ground. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was described as apocalyptic in scale. At one point in the struggle, Typhon managed to wound Zeus severely, tearing the sinews from his hands and feet and rendering him temporarily helpless, hiding the stolen sinews away in a cave guarded by a monstrous creature named Delphine. It was Hermes, along with the god Pan in some versions, who managed to recover the stolen sinews and restore Zeus to full strength. Restored, Zeus returned to the fight with renewed fury, pursuing Typhon across the earth and finally overwhelming him with an unrelenting barrage of thunderbolts. In the end, Zeus buried the defeated monster beneath Mount Etna in Sicily, where, according to later tradition, Typhon's continued fury from beneath the earth was said to explain the volcano's ongoing eruptions. Fire and smoke rising up from a defeated god, still straining against the mountain that entombed him. With Typhon defeated, Zeus's rule over the cosmos was finally secure. But securing the throne was only the beginning of his story. What followed would be centuries of myths concerning power, justice, temptation, family, and the complicated relationship between gods and the mortals who worshipped them. A wife swallowed whole even before the war with Typhon, Zeus had already made a decision that would come to define much of his character for the rest of mythology, a decision rooted in both wisdom and fear. His first true consort, according to the oldest traditions, was Medes, the very Titan who had once helped him free his siblings from within Cronus's body. Medes became pregnant, and it was at this point that Gaia and Uranus delivered a prophecy that struck fear into Zeus in a way that mirrored, almost exactly, the fear that had once driven his own father to swallow his children. The prophecy declared that Medes would first bear a daughter equal to Zeus in wisdom and courage, and that if she conceived again, she would bear a son destined to overthrow his father and become ruler of the heavens in his place. Zeus, unwilling to repeat his father's fate, but also unwilling to abandon the wisdom Medes embodied, chose an unusual and, to modern sensibilities, deeply unsettling solution. He swallowed Medes whole, absorbing her into his own being entirely. Some months later, Zeus began suffering from an unbearable headache. The pain grew so severe that he called upon Hephaestus, or in some versions Prometheus, to split his skull open with an axe in order to relieve it. From the wound emerged Athena, not as an infant, but as a fully grown goddess, dressed in complete armor, and already possessing the wisdom and battle skill that would define her for the rest of Greek mythology. In this single myth, Zeus had managed to prevent the prophecy from unfolding as feared, while also gaining, quite literally, the wisdom of Medes as a permanent part of himself, and fathering one of the most beloved and powerful goddesses in the entire Olympian pantheon. It was a resolution that revealed something essential about Zeus's character. He did not simply overpower threats to his rule the way his father had. He absorbed them, transformed them, and turned them into something that ultimately strengthened his position rather than merely eliminating a danger through brute force. The making of a marriage and a rivalry after Medes, Zeus took several other partners among the older generation of divine beings, each union producing offspring who would go on to shape different aspects of the cosmos. With Themis, the embodiment of divine order, he fathered the Horae, goddesses of the seasons and natural order, and the Moirai, the three fates who spun, measured, and cut the thread of every mortal life. With Mnemosyne, memory personified, he fathered the 9 muses, who would go on to inspire poetry, music, history, and the arts for every generation of mortals to come. With Eurynome and Oceanid, he fathered the 3 Graces, goddesses associated with charm, beauty, and creativity. But it was his marriage to Hera, his own sister, freed alongside him from within Cronus, that would come to define the central relationship of his entire reign. Hera became queen of Olympus, and their union was, at least officially, the model of divine marriage within Greek religion. Together they were said to have produced Ares, the god of war, Hebe, goddess of youth, and Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth. Hephaestus, the god of the forge, is also sometimes attributed to their union, though other traditions claim Hera produced him alone, without Zeus at all, in a kind of retaliation for Athena's birth. This detail matters because it establishes, almost immediately, the emotional undercurrent that would define Hera and Zeus's marriage for the rest of mythology. Zeus, despite his marriage, did not remain faithful, not even close. And Hera, proud, powerful, and fiercely protective of her position as queen, would spend much of Greek mythology directing her fury not at Zeus himself, who as king of the gods remained largely untouchable, but at the mortal women he pursued, and at the children born from those unions. The gods who rose from his affairs, it was through his many relationships with both goddesses and mortal women that Zeus fathered some of the most important figures in the entire Greek mythological tradition. And each of these unions came with consequences that rippled outward across generations. With Leto, a Titaness, Zeus fathered twins, Apollo and Artemis. Hera, enraged by the affair, pursued Leto relentlessly during her pregnancy, forbidding any land beneath the sun to offer her shelter. Leto wandered in desperation until she finally found refuge on the floating island of Delos, a place technically neither land nor sea, and therefore outside the boundaries of Hera's curse. There, clinging to a palm tree for support, Leto gave birth first to Artemis, who then, in a striking detail preserved in several ancient traditions, helped deliver her own twin brother Apollo moments later. From this painful and hunted beginning came two of the most powerful gods on Olympus, Apollo, god of prophecy, music, and the sun, and Artemis, goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, and the moon. With a mortal princess named Semele, daughter of Cadmus, king of Thebes, Zeus fathered Dionysus, though the circumstances of this birth were far more tragic. Hera, discovering the affair, disguised herself as an elderly woman and befriended Semele, planting a seed of doubt in her mind about whether her lover truly was Zeus at all. Semele, convinced by Hera's manipulation, begged Zeus to reveal himself to her in his true divine form, the same form in which he appeared before Hera herself. Zeus, bound by an unbreakable oath he had already sworn to grant Semele any wish, reluctantly agreed, knowing full well what would happen. When he revealed himself in his full glory, the sheer overwhelming power of a god's true form incinerated Semele instantly. Zeus, in the final moments, managed to save the unborn child from her womb and sewed the infant into his own thigh, carrying him to term himself. Months later, Dionysus was born a second time from his father's body, earning him the title in later tradition of the twice-born god. With Danae, a princess locked away in a bronze chamber by her own father, after a prophecy warned that her son would one day kill him, Zeus appeared in the form of a shower of golden light, and from that union came Perseus, the hero who would later slay Medusa and rescue Andromeda from a sea monster, fulfilling much of the very prophecy his grandfather had tried so desperately to prevent. With Europa, a Phoenician princess, Zeus took the form of a magnificent white bull, gentle and calm enough that Europa climbed onto his back to admire him, at which point the bull rose and carried her across the sea to the island of Crete. There, Zeus revealed his true identity, and their union produced Minos, who would later become king of Crete and, in one of mythology's darker turns, the ruler responsible for the labyrinth built to contain the monstrous Minotaur. With Leda, queen of Sparta, Zeus appeared in the form of a swan, and from this encounter came Helen, whose extraordinary beauty would, a generation later, become one of the central causes of the Trojan War, a conflict that would consume an entire generation of heroes and reshape the mythological landscape of the ancient world. Each of these unions followed a pattern that repeats throughout Zeus's mythology. Desire led to transformation, transformation led to consequence, and consequence rippled outward across generations, often landing not on Zeus himself, but on the mortal women he pursued, and on Hera's endless campaign of vengeance against them. The twins of Delos and the god who answered in riddles Apollo and Artemis, born on that floating island after Leto's long and hunted pregnancy, did not remain infants for long in the old stories. According to some traditions, Apollo reached full maturity within days of his birth, arming himself immediately with a golden bow forged by Hephaestus, and setting out from Delos with a single purpose in mind, to claim a place of his own in the world where he might speak for his father and guide mortals through prophecy. That place was Delphi, though it did not belong to Apollo at first. The site was guarded by a monstrous serpent named Python, born from the slime left behind after the Great Flood, or in other tellings set there deliberately by Hera to torment Leto during her wandering pregnancy. Apollo, only recently born himself, tracked the serpent to a cave on the slopes of Mount Parnassus and killed it with arrow after arrow, claiming the sacred site as his own in the process. To purify himself of the killing, since even gods were bound by certain laws concerning bloodshed, Apollo served a period of exile and servitude to a mortal king before finally establishing his oracle at Delphi, where a priestess known as the Pythia, named in memory of the serpent Apollo had slain, would sit upon a tripod above a chasm in the earth and speak the gods' prophecies in riddles that would shape the decisions of kings, generals, and ordinary mortals for centuries to come. Apollo's own love affairs carried a very different tone from his father's. Where Zeus's pursuits so often ended in triumph, however troubling the methods, Apollo's ended again and again in loss. He pursued a nymph named Daphne, daughter of a river god, only for her to beg her father for rescue as Apollo closed the distance behind her. And just as his hand brushed her shoulder, she began to transform, her skin hardening into bark, her arms lifting into branches, her feet rooting into the earth. Daphne became the laurel tree, and Apollo, grieving what he had lost, took its leaves as his own sacred symbol, crowning poets, victors, and prophets with laurel wreaths ever afterward as a quiet, permanent tribute to the one who had refused him. He loved a mortal youth named Hyacinthus as well, and while the two were competing at throwing a discus, the wind god Zephyrus, jealous of Apollo's affection, redirected the throw so that it struck Hyacinthus and killed him instantly. From the boy's spilled blood, Apollo caused a flower to bloom, naming it Hyacinth in his memory, marking its petals, according to legend, with a pattern that could still be read as a cry of grief in the old Greek alphabet. Apollo's son, born to the mortal princess Cronus, was Asclepius, who grew to become such a skilled healer that he could raise the dead, an ability that eventually drew Zeus's attention for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with cosmic order. If mortals could simply be revived whenever they died, the careful boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the very boundary Hades governed and depended upon, would collapse entirely. Zeus struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt to preserve that balance, and Apollo, enraged at the death of his son, retaliated by killing the Cyclopes who had forged the weapon, an act of defiance that led Zeus to sentence Apollo to a year of servitude as a mortal shepherd, tending the flocks of King Admetus of Thessaly, a humbling punishment for a god who had, until then, known only reverence. Artemis, meanwhile, grew into her own fierce and independent identity as goddess of the hunt and protector of the wilderness, asking her father, according to one charming tradition, for eternal maidenhood, a bow to match her brothers, and a company of nymphs to accompany her through the forests, all of which Zeus happily granted. She guarded her chosen way of life with an intensity that few dared to challenge, and those who did paid dearly for it. A hunter named Actaeon, wandering through the forest one afternoon, stumbled by accident upon Artemis and her nymphs bathing in a secluded spring. Furious at being seen in such a vulnerable state, Artemis transformed him instantly into a stag, and Actaeon's own hunting dogs, no longer recognizing their master, tore him apart before he could make a single sound of protest. Another hunter, a giant named Orion, became one of Artemis's closest companions, and according to differing traditions, either grew too boastful about his hunting prowess or was manipulated by Apollo, jealous of his sister's affection for the mortal, into unknowingly shooting Orion himself, mistaking the distant figure swimming in the sea for a target rather than her own friend. Grieving, Artemis placed Orion among the stars, where the constellation that bears his name still rises each winter, forever accompanied by his faithful hunting dogs, the constellations Canis Major and Canis Minor, trailing behind him across the night sky. Hera's long vengeance. Few stories capture Hera's fury more completely than the myth of Io, a mortal priestess whom Zeus pursued and eventually transformed into a white heifer in a desperate attempt to conceal the affair from his wife. Hera, unconvinced, asked for the heifer as a gift, and Zeus, unable to refuse without revealing his guilt, was forced to hand Io over. Hera then set the 100-eyed giant Argus Panops to guard her constantly, ensuring she could never again slip away to Zeus. Zeus sent Hermes to rescue her, and the messenger god, through patient storytelling and clever trickery, managed to lull all 100 of Argus's eyes to sleep before killing him. Hera, in tribute to her fallen servant, placed his 100 eyes upon the tail of the peacock, a bird sacred to her ever since. But her pursuit of Io did not end there. She sent a relentless gadfly to torment the transformed woman, driving her in a frenzied wandering journey across much of the known world before Io finally found relief in Egypt, where, according to later traditions, she was restored to human form and eventually became an ancestor of several important mythological bloodlines. This pattern, Zeus's affair, Hera's discovery, and a long, often devastating campaign of retribution against the mortal woman rather than against Zeus himself, appears again and again throughout the mythology. It is one of the more uncomfortable aspects of these ancient stories, and it reflects something the Greeks themselves seemed to understand about power. The king of the gods could act with near total impunity, while the consequences of his actions fell disproportionately on those with far less power to protect themselves. Perhaps nowhere is this pattern more visible than in the story of Heracles, arguably the most famous hero to ever descend from Zeus's countless affairs. Heracles was born to Alcmene, a mortal woman whom Zeus visited in the disguise of her own husband. From the moment of his birth, Hera's hatred for the child was unrelenting. She delayed his birth through trickery, sent serpents into his crib as an infant, and later, when he had grown into adulthood, inflicted a fit of madness upon him that led to the greatest tragedy of his life. It was this same madness, and the guilt that followed, that eventually set Heracles on the path toward his famous 12 labors, tasks assigned to him as penance, tasks that would ultimately transform him from a cursed son of Zeus into one of the greatest heroes the Greek world ever produced. The twice-born god and the price of his gifts Dionysus, carried to term in his father's own thigh after Semele's death, grew up far from Olympus, raised in secret by nymphs on Mount Nysa to keep him hidden from Hera's continuing jealousy, much as Zeus himself had once been hidden from Cronus a generation earlier. He grew into the god of wine, ecstasy, and theater, traveling widely across the known world before finally being accepted among the 12 great Olympians, often said to have taken the place once held by Hestia, who stepped aside from her throne so that her nephew might have a seat among the ruling gods. Among the most memorable stories of his adult life involved King Midas of Phrygia, who had once shown kindness to one of Dionysus's satyr companions and was offered, in gratitude, a single wish of his choosing. Midas, dazzled by greed, asked that everything he touched turn to gold. Dionysus granted the wish, and Midas's delight lasted only until he discovered that his food, his wine, and finally his own beloved daughter turned to lifeless gold the moment he embraced her, a curse of abundance that left him starving and grieving amid more wealth than any mortal had ever possessed. Dionysus, taking pity on the desperate king, instructed him to wash in the river Tantalus, which ever after was said to carry traces of gold within its sands, while Midas himself was restored, chastened, to an ordinary life. Not everyone who resisted Dionysus's worship met so gentle an end. Pentheus, king of Thebes and a cousin of the god through Semele's own sister, refused to acknowledge Dionysus's divinity or permit his ecstatic rites within the city, going so far as to imprison the god himself, not realizing who he had actually captured. Dionysus, amused rather than angered at first, escaped his chains effortlessly and lured the skeptical king toward the mountains to secretly observe the frenzied rituals of his female followers, the Maenads, women driven into a divine and uncontrollable ecstasy in his honor. Among those Maenads was Pentheus's own mother, Agave, who, caught in the gods' induced frenzy and unable to recognize her son, believed him to be a wild animal and tore him apart with her bare hands alongside the other women, only regaining her senses afterward to discover, in horror, exactly what she had done. It remained one of the darker warnings embedded throughout Greek mythology, that gods who offered joy and release could just as easily deliver devastation to those who refused to honor them. The trickster who stole from his own brother Hermes, born to Zeus, and the nymph Maia in a remote cave on Mount Cyllene, revealed a character unlike any of his siblings from the very first hours of his existence. According to the old Homeric hymn celebrating his birth, the infant god climbed from his cradle before the day was even finished, wandered outside, and promptly stole a herd of 50 cattle belonging to his half-brother Apollo, driving them backward to confuse their tracks and inventing, along the way, both the lyre, fashioned from a hollow tortoise shell, and a talent for persuasive lying so complete that when Apollo finally confronted him, the infant calmly denied any knowledge of cattle at all, suggesting, with a straight face, that he barely knew what a cow was. Zeus, hearing both sides of the dispute, found the entire episode more amusing than troubling, and ultimately brokered a reconciliation between his sons that established the character both gods would carry for the rest of mythology. Hermes gifted Apollo the lyre he had invented, and in exchange received Apollo's own herding staff, along with the god's blessing to become patron of travelers, thieves, merchants, and messengers, roles perfectly suited to a god who had demonstrated, within his very first day of existence, an unmatched gift for movement, cunning, and persuasion. It was Hermes, ever after, who served as Zeus's personal messenger, carrying divine commands across Olympus and down to mortals, and who alone among the gods could move freely between the world of the living and the shadowed realm of the dead, guiding departed souls safely to the banks of the river Styx. The god cast down from heaven Hephaestus, god of the forge, occupied an unusual place among the Olympians. Born, according to some traditions, from Hera alone, without Zeus's involvement at all, in a deliberate act of retaliation for Athena's birth from her husband's skull. Whatever his precise origin, Hephaestus was born with a physical difference that led Hera, ashamed of an imperfect child, to hurl him from the heights of Olympus down to the sea below, where he was rescued and raised by sea nymphs, learning the art of metalworking in a hidden underwater grotto far from the palace that had rejected him. Grown and skilled beyond any craftsman in the cosmos, Hephaestus eventually took a quiet revenge on the mother who had cast him out, constructing a magnificent golden throne and sending it to Olympus as a gift. The moment Hera sat upon it, invisible bonds sprang up and held her fast, and no god on Olympus, for all their combined strength, could free her. Only Hephaestus himself knew the trick to release the throne's mechanism, and he refused every request to return to Olympus and undo it, until Dionysus, in one of the more good-humored episodes of the mythology, got him thoroughly drunk and led him back to Olympus by donkey, where Hephaestus finally released his mother in exchange for marriage to Aphrodite, a union that granted him both a place among the ruling gods and a wife whose affections, as later myths would reveal, rarely remained solely his own. It was Hephaestus, catching Aphrodite in an affair with Ares, who devised his cleverest trap of all, forging a net of chains so fine they were nearly invisible and rigging it above his own marriage bed. When the two lovers next met there, the net dropped and bound them together, and Hephaestus summoned the other Olympians to witness the humiliating spectacle, a public shaming that Zeus himself, among the gathered gods, was said to have watched with more amusement than sympathy for anyone involved. A huntress turned to a bear among Hera's many targets was Callisto, a nymph devoted to Artemis and sworn, like all of that goddess's companions, to a life of perpetual chastity in the wild forests where she hunted. Zeus, catching sight of her, disguised himself as Artemis herself in order to approach without arousing suspicion, and it was only after Callisto became pregnant that her secret was discovered, at which point Artemis, in most versions of the story, expelled her from the sacred company of huntresses in anger and humiliation. Hera, learning of the child, transformed Callisto into a bear, condemning her to wander the forests in a form no longer recognizable even to those who had once loved her. Years later, Callisto's own son Arcas, grown into a young hunter himself, came upon the bear in the woods and very nearly killed his own mother without ever knowing who she was. Zeus intervened at the last possible moment, sweeping both mother and son up into the sky and setting them among the stars, where they remain today as the constellations Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the Great Bear and the Little Bear, forever circling the northern sky together, close enough to be near one another, yet never again able to touch. Athena's wisdom and its sharp edges the daughter born fully armed from Zeus's own skull grew into far more than simply a goddess of wisdom, in the gentle sense we might imagine today. Athena embodied a very particular kind of intelligence, strategic, disciplined, and closely tied to the just conduct of war, standing in deliberate contrast to her half-brother Ares, whose love of battle was chaotic and bloodthirsty, where hers was calculated and purposeful. She became patron of one of the greatest cities in the ancient world through a contest that revealed much about how the Greeks understood their gods' relationships with mortals. Poseidon and Athena each desired to be the patron deity of a young city on the coast of Attica, and rather than settle the dispute through force, as gods so often did, Zeus decreed that each would offer the city's people a gift, and the citizens themselves would choose which offering they valued more. Poseidon struck the rocky ground of the Acropolis with his trident, and a spring of water burst forth, though the water, being of the sea, was said to taste of salt and prove useless for drinking. Athena, in turn, planted an olive tree, offering the people food, oil for their lamps, and wood for their tools, a gift of quiet, lasting sustenance rather than dramatic spectacle. The people chose Athena's gift, and the city took her name, Athens, a name it carries even now, thousands of years after the contest that decided it. Not every mortal who tested Athena's skill found her generous. A young weaver named Arachne, gifted enough with a loom that she began to boast her talent surpassed even the goddess's own, eventually drew Athena down from Olympus in disguise to challenge the claim directly. When Arachne refused to recant her boast even after recognizing the goddess before her, the two wove competing tapestries side by side. Athena's depicted the majesty and order of the gods. Arachne's, in a display of both skill and reckless daring, depicted the many scandalous affairs and deceptions of Zeus himself, rendered so beautifully that Athena could find no fault in the craftsmanship, only in the audacity of the subject. Enraged, Athena tore the tapestry apart and struck Arachne, who, in despair and shame, attempted to hang herself. Athena, in a final act that mixed punishment with something almost like mercy, transformed the rope into a web and Arachne into the first spider, condemning her and all her descendants to weave for eternity, forever skilled, forever diminished. Aphrodite's web of love born, according to the oldest tradition, from the sea foam that gathered where Uranus's remains had fallen generations before Zeus was even born. Aphrodite occupied a strange position within the Olympian family, older in origin than many of the gods who now called her sister, yet bound just as tightly to the passions and complications that Zeus himself so often set into motion. Zeus, according to several traditions, arranged Aphrodite's marriage to Hephaestus, the lame and unglamorous god of the forge, perhaps as a way of curbing the chaos her beauty seemed destined to cause among the other gods by settling her within a stable union. The arrangement did little to contain her. Aphrodite's love affairs, both with gods and with mortals, produced some of the most enduring stories in the entire mythology, quite apart from Zeus's own tangled family history, though they often intersected with it directly, as when her son by the mortal prince Anchises, a boy named Aeneas, survived the fall of Troy, and according to later Roman tradition, carried the bloodline forward into the founding of an entirely new civilization. Her own son by Ares, the mischievous Eros, would grow into the very embodiment of desire itself, and it was Eros who, according to a much later but enormously beloved tale, fell in love with a mortal princess named Psyche after being sent by his jealous mother to punish the girl for her legendary beauty. Instead of following his mother's command, Eros fell for Psyche himself, visiting her only in darkness and forbidding her ever to look upon his face. When Psyche's own curiosity finally got the better of her, much as Pandora's once had, she lit a lamp to see her mysterious husband while he slept, and a drop of hot oil fell and woke him, driving him away in heartbreak. Psyche's journey to win him back, including a series of nearly impossible tasks assigned by Aphrodite herself, eventually earned her a place among the immortals, and Zeus, moved by the devotion the two had shown one another, granted Psyche divinity so that the union of love and the soul, for that is what her name meant, could finally endure without interruption. Aphrodite's affections did not always end so gently. She fell deeply for a mortal hunter named Adonis, extraordinarily beautiful even by the standards of gods, and when he was fatally gored by a wild boar during a hunt, some traditions claiming the boar was sent by a jealous Ares, Aphrodite's grief was said to have stained the anemone flower red with her tears and his blood, a fragile bloom that still appears each spring, blooming briefly before its petals scatter, much like the short and beautiful life it was said to commemorate. A boastful queen and a grieving mother, not every tragedy connected to Zeus's family arose directly from his own affairs. Sometimes it was the pride of mortals that drew his household into conflict. Niobe, queen of Thebes and proud mother of 14 children, once made the fatal mistake of boasting publicly that her own fertility surpassed that of the goddess Leto, who had borne only 2 children, Apollo and Artemis. The insult reached the twins almost immediately, and their response was swift and merciless. Apollo, with his silver bow, struck down Niobe's sons one by one as they trained and played, while Artemis, with equal precision, struck down her daughters. Niobe, watching her entire family destroyed within moments, was left utterly broken by grief, and according to tradition, wept so continuously and so completely that she was eventually transformed into stone, a weeping rock face on a distant mountainside said to still shed tears whenever the winter snow melted upon it. Zeus himself, moved by the scale of the tragedy despite its origins in his own children's fury, was said to have restored the bodies of Niobe's children for proper burial 9 days after their deaths, a rare gesture of mercy amid a story otherwise defined by unforgiving consequence. The son he could not save, perhaps no story, reveals the limits of even Zeus's power more clearly than that of Sarpedon, his mortal son by a woman named Laodamia, who grew to become a great king and warrior fighting on the side of Troy during the long war that consumed a generation of heroes. As the battle raged fiercely around the Greek ships, Sarpedon fought valiantly among the Trojan ranks, and Zeus, watching from Olympus, found himself torn in a way that few myths ever show him experiencing. He knew, through the unbending decree of fate, that his son's death at Troy was already fixed, unavoidable, a debt owed to destiny that not even the king of the gods could erase. Hera reminded him, according to Homer's account, that if he saved Sarpedon now, every other god with a mortal child fighting in that same war would demand the same mercy for their own children, unraveling the fragile order that held fate and divine will in balance. Zeus, grieving, chose not to intervene, and Sarpedon fell in battle at the hands of Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion. But even in that grief, Zeus found one final act of tenderness he could still perform. He sent down a shower of blood-red rain upon the battlefield in mourning, and dispatched sleep and death themselves, gentle divine twins, to carry his son's body away from the chaos of war, back to his homeland in Lycia, where he could be given a proper burial among his own people rather than left to rot upon a foreign battlefield. It remains one of the most quietly devastating moments in all of Greek mythology, a reminder that even the ruler of the heavens, bound by the same fate that governed mortals and gods alike, could not always protect the ones he loved most. A feast that offended the gods, not all of Zeus's children, brought him pride. Tantalus, a mortal son of Zeus and a king greatly favored among the gods, once betrayed that trust in a manner so grotesque that his name became forever synonymous with a very particular kind of punishment. Invited to dine among the gods themselves, Tantalus attempted, according to the most widely told version of his story, to test the gods' omniscience by killing his own son Pelops, cooking the boy's flesh, and serving it to the assembled Olympians as a meal, hoping to see whether they would recognize the horror before them. Most of the gods immediately sensed the abomination and refused to touch the food, though Demeter, distracted by grief over her still missing daughter Persephone, absently consumed a portion of the shoulder before realizing what had been done. The gods, appalled, restored Pelops to life, replacing the missing piece of shoulder with one carved from ivory, a detail said to explain a distinctive mark carried by his descendants for generations afterward. Zeus's punishment for Tantalus was severe even by the standards of divine justice, banishing him to Tartarus and condemning him to stand forever in a pool of water beneath branches heavy with fruit, tortured eternally by hunger and thirst he could never satisfy, the water receding each time he bent to drink, the fruit lifting just out of reach each time he raised his hand toward it, a punishment so precisely cruel that it gave the English language its own word for endless, unreachable temptation. Tantalize, still used today by people who have long since forgotten the grieving father and betrayed king from whom it first came. A curse that outlived Tantalus, the horror of that banquet, did not end with Tantalus's own punishment. His restored son Pelops grew to manhood carrying, in some strange way, the memory of what had been done to him, and his own descendants would go on to inherit a kind of hereditary darkness that Greek tragedians would still be exploring on the Athenian stage centuries later. Pelops himself won his bride, a princess named Hippodamia, through a chariot race against her father, a contest he secured only by bribing the king's charioteer to sabotage the axle of his master's chariot. When the charioteer later demanded the reward he had been promised, Pelops betrayed him as well, hurling him into the sea, and the dying man's curse upon Pelops and all his descendants was said to be the true origin of the family's unending misfortune. A curse that some traditions suggest Zeus himself, ever mindful of broken oaths and betrayed trust, allowed to take root and grow. Pelops's own sons, Atreus and Thyestes, carried the family's capacity for betrayal into the next generation, competing bitterly for the throne of Mycenae. Thyestes seduced his brother's wife and attempted to steal the kingdom through treachery, and when Atreus discovered the betrayal, his revenge surpassed even his grandfather Tantalus's infamous crime. He murdered Thyestes' own sons, prepared their flesh, and served it to his unknowing brother at a supposed feast of reconciliation, revealing the truth only after Thyestes had already eaten, presenting him with the small hands and feet of his own children as proof of what he had just consumed. Thyestes fled into exile, cursing his brother's entire line, a curse that would eventually fall upon Atreus' own son, a king named Agamemnon, who would one day lead the combined armies of Greece against Troy, and whose own household, waiting for him back home during those long years of war, was quietly plotting a vengeance of its own, a final chapter in a family curse that had, by then, been unfolding for 3 full generations, and that some storytellers trace back, ultimately, to a single grotesque meal Tantalus once tried to serve to the gods themselves upon Olympus. A brother's search and a city born from dragon's teeth. Europa's abduction by the disguised Zeus did not go unanswered by her own family. Her father, king of Phoenicia, sent his sons out in different directions to search for her, under strict instruction not to return home without their sister. One of these brothers, a prince named Cadmus, searched for years without success, eventually consulting the oracle at Delphi for guidance, only to be told that continuing the search was pointless, that Europa's disappearance had been the work of a god and could not be reversed by mortal effort. Instead, the oracle instructed Cadmus to abandon his quest entirely and follow a special cow he would soon encounter, building a new city at the exact spot where the animal finally lay down to rest. Cadmus followed the oracle's strange instruction, and where the cow eventually settled, he founded a city that would become Thebes, one of the great powers of ancient Greece and the setting for so many of its darkest myths, including, generations later, the very story of Pentheus and Dionysus that had unfolded within its walls. Before the city could be properly established, Cadmus needed water for a sacrifice and sent his men to a nearby spring, unaware that it was guarded by a fearsome serpent sacred to Ares. The serpent killed most of his men, and Cadmus, in retaliation, slew the creature himself, only to be instructed afterward by Athena to sow its teeth into the freshly turned earth like seeds. From the buried teeth sprang a race of fully armed warriors, bursting up from the ground ready for battle, and confused about who among them was friend or enemy. They turned on each other in a furious and bloody skirmish until only 5 remained standing. These 5 survivors, known ever after as the Sparkle, meaning the sown men, became the founding noble families of Thebes, an entire aristocratic lineage born, quite literally, from the teeth of a dragon planted in the ground. Cadmus, having killed a creature sacred to Ares, was made to serve the war god for a period of years as penance, after which he was finally permitted to marry Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, uniting the bloodlines of war and love in a wedding attended, according to tradition, by the Olympian gods themselves, a rare honor extended to a mortal founder whose long and difficult search for his lost sister had, in the end, led him to build one of the most storied cities in the entire Greek world. Cadmus and Harmonia's own descendants would go on to include Semele, whose union with Zeus produced Dionysus, meaning that the god of wine and ecstasy, in a strange and fitting turn of mythological genealogy, descended directly from the very brother who had once searched so desperately for the sister Zeus had carried away to Crete. The bull from the sea, among the many consequences of Zeus's disguise as a magnificent white bull, and his abduction of the Phoenician princess Europa, was a son named Minos, who grew to become king of Crete and one of the most consequential rulers in the entire mythological tradition. Minos prayed to Poseidon for a magnificent white bull to prove his right to rule, promising to sacrifice the animal in the sea god's honor once it appeared. When the bull arrived, so beautiful that Minos could not bring himself to kill it, he sacrificed a lesser animal in its place and kept the extraordinary bull for himself, a deception that Poseidon, much like Zeus in so many other stories, did not forgive. As punishment, Poseidon caused Minos's own wife, Pasiphae, to fall into an unnatural and consuming passion for the bull itself. With the help of the brilliant craftsman Daedalus, who constructed a hollow wooden cow that allowed her to conceal herself convincingly enough to conceive, Pasiphae gave birth to a monstrous child, half man and half bull, a creature that came to be known as the Minotaur. Ashamed and horrified by what his household had produced, Minos again turned to Daedalus, commanding him to build a structure so vast and confusing that the creature could be sealed away from the world entirely, a sprawling maze of endless corridors known ever since as the labyrinth. Into this maze, according to the terms of a war Minos had won against Athens, 7 young men and 7 young women were sent from that city every 9 years, offered as tribute, and left to wander the labyrinth's corridors until the Minotaur inevitably found and devoured them. It was the Athenian prince Theseus, son of Poseidon in some traditions and of a mortal king in others, who finally volunteered to join the tribute, determined to end the cycle of sacrifice for good. Arriving on Crete, he caught the attention of Minos's own daughter, Ariadne, who fell in love with him and secretly provided a ball of thread, a gift from Daedalus himself, which Theseus unwound behind him as he ventured deeper into the maze, ensuring he could find his way back out again. He found the Minotaur at the heart of the labyrinth and killed it, then followed the thread back to the entrance and escaped Crete with Ariadne at his side, though in a detail many later listeners find difficult to forgive. He abandoned her on the island of Naxos during their journey home, whether through deliberate cruelty, divine intervention, or simple forgetfulness, depending on which ancient source one consults. Dionysus, discovering her there alone and heartbroken, took her as his own bride instead, one small mercy within an otherwise painful story. Daedalus, punished by Minos for having helped Ariadne betray her father's secret, was imprisoned within the very labyrinth he had built, along with his young son Icarus. Determined to escape, the brilliant craftsman constructed 2 pairs of wings from feathers and wax, and father and son took flight from the island together. Daedalus warned his son repeatedly not to fly too close to the sun, where the heat would melt the wax holding his wings together, nor too close to the sea, where the damp would weigh the feathers down. Icarus, exhilarated by the freedom of flight, ignored his father's warning and climbed higher and higher, until the sun's heat did exactly what Daedalus had feared, melting the wax and sending the boy plunging into the sea below, a body of water still called the Icarian Sea in ancient geography, named forever after a boy who flew too close to something too powerful for him to touch. Not every major conflict of Zeus's reign involved romantic pursuit. Some of the most significant myths concerning his rule as king of the gods dealt with something far larger, his relationship with humanity itself. According to tradition, it was Prometheus, the Titan who had sided with Zeus during the war against Cronus, who either created humans from clay or, in other versions, simply served as their great protector and advocate among the gods. Whatever the precise origin, Prometheus felt a deep loyalty toward the fragile, mortal race, one that Zeus, increasingly focused on maintaining strict boundaries between gods and men, did not share. The tension between them came to a head during a dispute over how sacrifices should be divided between gods and mortals. Prometheus, testing Zeus's judgment, prepared 2 portions from a sacrificed ox, hiding the good meat inside an unappealing stomach lining, while wrapping the bones in glistening, tempting fat. He then offered Zeus the choice. Zeus, whether deceived or simply choosing to allow the deception in order to justify what came next, selected the portion wrapped in fat, and from that moment forward, it became tradition for mortals to burn only bones and fat for the gods during sacrifice, keeping the meat for themselves. Zeus, furious at having been outmaneuvered, retaliated by withholding fire from humanity entirely, leaving them cold, vulnerable, and unable to cook their food or forge tools. Prometheus, unwilling to watch mortals suffer, stole fire from Olympus, hiding a burning ember inside a hollow fennel stalk, and delivered it back down to earth. Zeus's punishment for this act of defiance was severe and lasting. Prometheus was bound to a remote mountain, often identified as being in the Caucasus, where an eagle, sometimes described as a symbol of Zeus's own power, descended each day to devour his liver. Because Prometheus was immortal, his liver regenerated overnight, only to be devoured again the following day, an endless cycle of suffering that continued for generations, until Heracles, during his own wandering adventures, finally freed him. But Prometheus's theft of fire was not the only price humanity paid. Zeus, determined to introduce suffering into the world of men as balance for the gift they had received, ordered the creation of the first woman. Hephaestus shaped her from earth and water, and each of the gods contributed a gift, beauty from Aphrodite, skill from Athena, and according to Hermes' contribution, a nature capable of deception and curiosity. She was named Pandora, meaning all gifted, and she was sent down to earth bearing a great jar, sometimes translated in later centuries as a box, which she had been strictly forbidden to open. Pandora's curiosity eventually overcame her, and when she lifted the lid, every evil that had until then remained hidden from human experience, disease, hardship, grief, and countless other torments, poured out into the world. Only one thing remained trapped inside as she hastily closed the container, a spirit the Greeks called Elpis, most often translated as hope. Scholars and storytellers have debated for centuries whether hope remaining inside the jar was meant as a comfort or a tragedy, whether it means humanity was left with hope to sustain them through hardship, or whether it means hope itself remains forever locked away, just out of reach. The ancient Greeks themselves seem to hold this ambiguity deliberately, understanding, perhaps, that certainty on such matters was never really the point. The king who served human flesh Zeus's concern for justice among mortals extended well beyond his own household, and nowhere is this clearer than in the story of Lycaon, a king of Arcadia whose name would eventually give rise to the very word we still use for a person transformed into a wolf. Hearing troubling reports of wickedness spreading among humanity, Zeus disguised himself as a humble traveler and descended to Lycaon's palace to see the truth for himself, testing, as he so often did throughout mythology, whether the ancient and sacred law of hospitality, the duty to welcome and protect any stranger who arrived at one's door, still held any meaning among mortals. Lycaon, suspicious of his guests' claim to divinity, devised a horrifying test of his own, murdering a hostage, or in some versions one of his own sons, and serving the flesh mixed into a meal set before his unsuspecting visitor, hoping to determine once and for all whether the traveler was truly a god capable of recognizing what had been done. Zeus, recognizing the abomination instantly, overturned the table in fury, incinerated Lycaon's remaining sons with a bolt of lightning, and transformed the king himself into a wolf, condemning him to wander the wilderness in a shape that finally matched the savagery he had shown while still wearing the form of a man. It was this single act of horrifying disrespect, according to the poet Ovid's later retelling, that convinced Zeus humanity as a whole could no longer be trusted, and that the world required the same drastic cleansing that would soon arrive in the form of the Great Flood, a single king's crime against hospitality becoming, in the end, the spark that condemned nearly an entire species to drowning. A house built from two kinds of mercy, not every mortal disappointed him, and Zeus, wandering the earth alongside Hermes in disguise on a later occasion, encountered exactly the opposite kind of household in the elderly couple Baucis and Philemon, who lived humbly in the hill country of Phrygia. Traveling as ordinary strangers, Zeus and Hermes were turned away from door after door in a nearby village, refused shelter, food, or basic kindness by wealthier households who saw nothing in two ragged travelers worth their trouble. Only Baucis and Philemon, poor themselves and with little to offer, welcomed the strangers into their tiny cottage, sharing what modest food and wine they possessed with a generosity that far outweighed their means, and noticing, to their growing astonishment, that no matter how many times they refilled the wine pitcher, it never seemed to run empty. Recognizing the gods before them at last, the elderly couple begged forgiveness for the poor quality of their hospitality, and Zeus, moved by their kindness, revealed his true identity and led them up to a nearby hilltop, where he showed them that the entire valley below, including the inhospitable village that had turned him away, had been swallowed by a sudden flood, every unwelcoming household drowned beneath the rising water, while their own humble cottage alone remained standing. transformed in that same instant into a magnificent temple. Asked what reward they wished for their kindness, Baucis and Philemon requested only to serve as caretakers of that temple for the remainder of their lives, and to die together at the same moment, so that neither would ever have to grieve the other's loss. Zeus granted both requests, and when their long lives finally ended, the couple was transformed together into two intertwining trees standing before the temple entrance, an oak and a linden, forever rooted side by side, a lasting tribute to the idea that among all the qualities Zeus valued in mortals, the simple willingness to welcome a stranger ranked among the very highest. According to Hesiod, humanity did not simply exist as a single, unchanging population from the beginning. Instead, the Greeks believed in a succession of ages, each one representing a different relationship between mortals and the gods, and each one, notably, in a state of decline from the one before it. The first was the Golden Age, corresponding to the reign of Cronus, when humans lived without labor, without conflict, and without the burden of old age, dying peacefully as though simply falling asleep. When this generation passed, Hesiod claimed they became benevolent spirits, watching over the mortal world that followed them. Next came the Silver Age, a generation of humans who lived long, protected childhoods under the careful watch of their mothers, but who grew into foolish and impious adults, refusing to honor the gods properly. Zeus, angered by this negligence, destroyed them, though they too were granted a kind of continued existence as spirits beneath the earth. Then came the Bronze Age, a generation forged for violence, delighting in war and destruction, wielding weapons and tools made entirely of bronze. This generation ultimately destroyed itself through endless conflict, descending into the underworld without honor or remembrance. A fourth age followed, often set apart from the metallic progression, known as the Age of Heroes, populated by the demigods and legendary figures whose stories would eventually fill the great myths of Thebes and Troy. Many of these heroes died in battle, though some, according to tradition, were granted a peaceful afterlife on the Isles of the Blessed. Finally came the Iron Age, the age Hesiod himself claimed to be living in, marked by hardship, labor, and moral decline. A generation burdened by toil, conflict, and the slow erosion of respect between parents and children, guests and hosts, and even brothers and sisters. It was during the transition between these ages, according to later traditions, particularly the transition away from the corrupted Bronze Age, that Zeus, disgusted by the wickedness and impiety spreading among mortals, decided that humanity needed to be nearly erased entirely and allowed to begin again. He sent a devastating flood to cover the earth, drowning nearly every living person. Only two mortals survived, Deucalion, son of Prometheus, and his wife Hera, who had been warned in advance by Prometheus, foresight remaining, as ever, one of that Titan's defining traits even after his own suffering at Zeus's hands. The couple built a great chest, or ark, and floated upon the rising waters until they eventually came to rest on Mount Parnassus as the floodwaters finally receded. Grieving the loss of nearly all humanity, Deucalion and Hera sought guidance from an oracle and were instructed, cryptically, to throw the bones of their mother behind them as they walked. After some confusion and contemplation, they understood the riddle. Their mother was the earth itself, and her bones were the stones scattered across its surface. As they threw stones over their shoulders, the stones thrown by Deucalion transformed into men, and those thrown by Pyrrha transformed into women, repopulating the earth with a new generation of humanity, one that Zeus, having enacted his judgment, allowed to flourish once more. A kingdom without end through war, through cunning, through devastating consequence and reluctant mercy. Zeus's rule over the heavens became permanent. He was not universally loved, not even by his own family. Hera's resentment simmered for the entirety of their marriage. Prometheus's punishment revealed a capacity for cruelty that stood in uncomfortable contrast to Zeus's role as protector of guests, oaths, and justice among mortals. And the long list of mortal women pursued, transformed, and often left to bear the consequences of Zeus's desire, tells its own difficult story about power left unchecked. And yet, it was also Zeus who maintained the fragile balance of the entire Olympian order for generation after generation. It was Zeus who punished those who broke sacred oaths, who protected the ancient custom of hospitality between strangers, who oversaw the rise and fall of entire heroic bloodlines, guiding, whether directly or indirectly, the destinies of Perseus, Heracles, Minos, Helen, and so many others whose stories would define the age of heroes that followed. By the time later poets like Homer were composing the great epics of Troy and Odysseus's long journey home, Zeus had become something more than simply a powerful god among many. He had become the ultimate arbiter of fate itself, the one whose scales, in Homer's imagery, weighed the destinies of entire armies, the one whose nod alone was said to shake the foundations of Olympus. The Titans remained bound in Tartarus. The Golden Age had long since faded into memory. Prometheus, eventually freed by Heracles, was reconciled in later tradition to the very order he had once defied. And Zeus, thunderbolt in hand, ruled on, watching over a world shaped as much by his failures and cruelties as by his justice and wisdom. And through it all, his reign endured, though not without cost, and not without grief that reached even into his own household. The giant's rise against Olympus Typhon was not the only threat Gaia sent against her grandson's throne. Long resentful that Zeus and his siblings had cast so many of her Titan children into Tartarus, she had also given birth, from the blood of Uranus that once fell upon her, to a race of enormous warriors known as the Giants. Unlike the Titans, the Giants were born specifically for war, armed from birth with an instinctive hatred of the Olympian order, and it was only a matter of time before that hatred found its outlet. The conflict that followed became known as the Gigantomachy, and it unfolded very differently from the war against the Titans. An oracle had warned Zeus that the gods alone could not defeat the giants. That victory would require the assistance of a mortal hero fighting alongside them. Gaia, hearing this same prophecy, searched desperately for a certain herb that would render the giants immune even to mortal weapons, hoping to close that one loophole before Zeus could exploit it. Zeus, learning of her plan, commanded the sun, the moon, and the dawn to withhold their light until he himself had gathered every last stalk of the herb, denying Gaia the chance to protect her children. Zeus then sent for Heracles, not yet born at the time some traditions place this myth, or in other versions already grown into the great hero he would become, to fight at the god's side. Athena crushed one giant beneath the island of Sicily. Dionysus, wielding little more than a thyrsus staff in the frenzy of his followers, helped bring down another. Hephaestus struck one giant with molten metal fresh from his forge, and it was Heracles, loosing arrow after arrow, who delivered the final blows that the gods alone could not, fulfilling the prophecy and securing Olympus once again. The giants were eventually buried beneath mountains and islands across the Mediterranean, much as Typhon had been buried beneath Etna, their ongoing fury said to explain earthquakes and volcanic tremors for centuries after the war had ended. With the Titans imprisoned, Typhon defeated, and now the giants crushed, no serious challenge to Zeus's rule would ever rise again from the earth itself. What remained were smaller, more human dramas, stories of love, jealousy, ambition, and grief, played out not across the heavens, but through the lives of gods and mortals alike. The twins who raised a city's walls among Zeus's mortal unions was one with Antiope, a princess of Thebes who fled her home to escape her father's anger after her affair with the god was discovered, eventually giving birth to twin sons, Amphion and Zethus, whom she was forced to abandon on a remote mountainside shortly after their birth. The twins were found and raised by a shepherd, growing to manhood without any knowledge of their true parentage, Amphion drawn toward music and the lyre, said to have been gifted to him by Hermes himself, while Zethus grew into a herdsman of great physical strength, each brother developing gifts that seemed, in their own way, to be a quiet inheritance from the divine father neither of them had ever known. Years later, learning of their mother's mistreatment at the hands of her own uncle and his cruel wife, the twins returned to Thebes and took their revenge, then set about the task of fortifying the city with walls strong enough to protect it from future harm. According to the most beautiful version of this myth, Zethus labored to haul the heavy stones into place through sheer physical effort, while Amphion simply played his lyre, and the stones, charmed by the music's beauty, rose and settled into position on their own, fitting themselves together into towering walls without a single hand needed to lift them. A lasting testament to the idea that even in a mythology built so heavily around strength and conquest, there remained room for the belief that beauty itself could be its own kind of power. The ant people of a plague-stricken island Zeus's affair with a nymph named Aegina, daughter of a river god, produced a son named Aeacus, who grew up alone on a deserted island his father had named in his mother's honor, and who eventually became so renowned for his piety and fairness that mortals prayed to him directly during times of drought, and the gods themselves were said to have called upon him to help settle disputes among themselves. When Hera, still nursing old resentment over yet another of her husband's affairs, sent a devastating plague to wipe out the island's population, Aeacus, left almost entirely alone, prayed to his father for help in repopulating his kingdom. Zeus answered by transforming every ant living beneath a nearby sacred oak tree into fully formed men and women, industrious and loyal by nature, exactly as the ants themselves had been. Aeacus named this new people the Myrmidons, from the Greek word for ant, and it was this same fiercely loyal people, generations later, who would follow Aeacus's own great-grandson Achilles across the sea to fight and die beneath the walls of Troy. A direct thread connecting one of Zeus's smaller, quieter mercies to the bloodiest war in all of Greek mythology. Among the more unusual stories to emerge from Zeus's long list of attachments was his fascination not with a goddess or a mortal woman, but with a young Trojan prince named Ganymede, said to be the most beautiful youth ever born among mortals. According to tradition, Zeus transformed himself into an eagle, or sent an eagle in his place, and carried the boy up from the fields of Troy to Olympus itself. There Ganymede was granted immortality and given the honored role of cupbearer to the gods, pouring nectar at their feasts, a position that had previously belonged to Hebe, Zeus and Hera's own daughter. Hera, predictably, resented the boy's presence, one more reminder of her husband's wandering attention, though even she could do little to challenge Zeus's decision. In later centuries, the constellation Aquarius, the water-bearer, was said by some to represent Ganymede, forever fixed in the night sky pouring out his eternal service among the stars, a boy from Troy who never grew old, and who was there, generations later, still watching from the heavens when his own city finally fell to the Greeks. Perseus and the fulfillment of a prophecy, the child born from Zeus's golden shower, and the imprisoned princess Danae grew up far from any palace, raised humbly on the island of Seriphos, where the chest-carrying mother and infant had washed ashore after Danae's own father, King Acrisius of Argos, cast them out to sea rather than risk the prophecy that had haunted him, a prophecy warning that his own grandson would one day be the cause of his death. Perseus grew into a strong and capable young man, and it was the island's king, Polydectes, who unknowingly set his heroic destiny into motion. Wishing to remove Perseus from his path so that he might freely pursue Danae, Polydectes tricked the young man into promising a gift he could not possibly refuse to attempt, the head of Medusa, one of the three Gorgon sisters, whose gaze alone turned any living creature to stone. Medusa had not always been a monster. According to one widely told version of her story, she had once been a beautiful mortal priestess in the temple of Athena, until Poseidon violated her within the sacred space itself. Athena, furious at the desecration of her temple, punished not Poseidon but Medusa, transforming her hair into serpents and cursing her face to turn any onlooker instantly to stone, a punishment that reveals, uncomfortably, how often ancient myths placed consequence on the victim rather than the offender. Whatever her origin, Medusa now lived at the edge of the known world alongside her two immortal Gorgon sisters, and it was toward this deadly destination that Perseus now traveled, guided and equipped by gods who had taken an interest in his fate. Athena, herself connected to Medusa's curse, provided a polished bronze shield that Perseus could use as a mirror, allowing him to approach and strike without ever looking directly at the Gorgon's face. Hermes lent him winged sandals for swift flight and a curved sword capable of cutting through Medusa's scales. From the nymphs of the underworld, Perseus obtained a cap of invisibility, borrowed in some versions from Hades himself. Perseus tracked down the Gorgon's lair, and using his shield's reflection to guide his strike, beheaded Medusa while she slept, careful never to meet her petrifying gaze directly. From her severed neck sprang two extraordinary offspring, conceived earlier with Poseidon, the winged horse Pegasus, and a warrior named Chrysaor, both bursting into existence in the instant of her death. On his journey home, carrying Medusa's head safely sealed within a special pouch, Perseus passed over the kingdom of Ethiopia, where he came upon a princess named Andromeda, chained to a rock at the edge of the sea as a sacrifice meant to appease a sea monster sent by Poseidon after her mother's careless boast of beauty had offended the sea nymphs. Perseus, immediately captivated, defeated the monster and freed her, later marrying her and bringing her home with him as his wife. Returning at last to Seriphos, Perseus discovered that Polydex had continued pressuring Danae in his absence. In a final act of justice, Perseus revealed Medusa's head before the king and his court, turning them all instantly to stone. Later, participating in athletic games in a distant kingdom, Perseus threw a discus that veered off course and struck an elderly spectator in the crowd, killing him instantly. That spectator was Acrisius, his own grandfather, fulfilling the very prophecy that had once caused Danae and her infant son to be cast out to sea in the first place, a fate that, for all of Acrisius's careful precautions, proved entirely impossible to escape. The huntress and the boar sent in anger among the heroines who moved through this world of gods and monsters. Few were as unusual or as celebrated as Atalanta, a woman raised in the wilderness after her own father, disappointed to have a daughter rather than a son, abandoned her on a mountainside as an infant. She was nursed by a she-bear sent, according to tradition, by Artemis herself, and grew into a swift and fearless huntress who rejected the traditional expectations placed on women of her time, choosing instead a life devoted to the hunt and to her own independence. Her name became forever tied to the myth of the Caledonian boar, a monstrous creature sent by Artemis to ravage the countryside of Caledon after its king neglected to include her in an annual sacrifice offered to the gods, honoring every other Olympian except her. The king's son, Meleager, gathered together many of the greatest heroes of that generation for a great hunt to bring the beast down, and among those who answered the call was Atalanta, whose participation was met with open hostility from several of the male hunters, unwilling to accept a woman's place among them despite her evident skill. It was Atalanta who drew first blood, striking the boar with an arrow before any of her companions managed to land a blow, and Meleager, who had grown to admire her both for her ability and her courage, ultimately delivered the killing strike himself before insisting that the boar's hide, the trophy of the hunt, be awarded to Atalanta in recognition of her decisive contribution. This decision, and the affection behind it, ignited a furious dispute among the other hunters, several of them Meleager's own uncles, who felt the honor of the kill, and its prize, belonged to the men who had actually ended the creature's life, rather than to a woman who had merely wounded it first. The argument escalated into violence, and Meleager, defending Atalanta's honor, killed his own uncles in the ensuing chaos, an act that led, through a tangled chain of grief and vengeance within his own family, to his own death not long afterward, Another reminder of how quickly pride and honor could turn even a triumphant hunt into a family tragedy. Atalanta's own story continued well beyond that hunt, eventually including a famous foot race in which she agreed to marry only the suitor who could outrun her, killing every man who failed. It was Aphrodite, moved to intervene, who gave a suitor named Hippomenes 3 golden apples to drop during the race, apples so beautiful that Atalanta, despite her focus and speed, could not resist pausing each time to retrieve one, allowing Hippomenes to win the race, and her hand, through a combination of divine assistance and clever distraction, rather than raw athletic ability alone. The rider who reached too high from Medusa's severed neck, as she fell beneath Perseus's blade, there sprang the winged horse Pegasus, a creature that would go on to carry its own hero into legend a generation later. That hero was Bellerophon, a prince of Corinth who, after being falsely accused of a crime he did not commit, was sent to the kingdom of Lycia carrying a sealed letter that, unknown to him, instructed the king to have him killed. Rather than execute a guest directly, a violation of the sacred laws of hospitality that even kings dared not break lightly, the Lycian king instead assigned Bellerophon a task he assumed to be a death sentence in disguise: the slaying of the Chimera, a monstrous creature with the body of a lion, the head of a goat rising from its back, and a serpent for a tail, breathing fire that scorched entire hillsides wherever it roamed. The Chimera was said to be the offspring of Typhon and Echidna, siblings, in a sense, to Cerberus and countless other monsters that haunted the corners of the Greek mythological world. Bellerophon, guided by a dream sent from Athena, found and tamed Pegasus using a golden bridle the goddess provided, and from the safety of the winged horse's back, he was able to strike at the Chimera from above, beyond the reach of its flames, eventually driving a spear tipped with lead into its fire-breathing throat, where the molten metal melted and choked the beast from within. Bellerophon's victory only deepened the king's determination to see him dead, and further trials followed, ambushes and impossible tasks, each of which the hero survived, until the king, recognizing at last that the gods themselves seemed to favor this young man, abandoned his scheme entirely, and instead gave Bellerophon his own daughter in marriage and half his kingdom to rule. For a time, it seemed as though Bellerophon had achieved everything a mortal hero could hope for. But success in Greek mythology so often curdles into pride, and pride, when it grows large enough, tends to draw the attention of Olympus. Convinced that his triumphs entitled him to more than mortal life could offer, Bellerophon attempted to ride Pegasus all the way up to the halls of Olympus itself, seeking to take his place among the gods he had, until then, only ever served. Zeus, unwilling to allow a mortal to simply climb his way into immortality through sheer audacity, sent a single gadfly to sting Pegasus mid-flight. The startled horse threw its rider, and Bellerophon fell back down to earth, crippled and blinded by the fall, spending the remainder of his life wandering alone, avoiding the sight of other men, a hero undone not by any monster, but by his own reach exceeding what the gods were willing to grant him. Pegasus, meanwhile, continued on to Olympus without him, where the winged horse was given a place of honor, eventually tasked with carrying Zeus's own thunderbolts. No child of Zeus endured a more difficult path toward glory than Heracles, born to the mortal woman Alcmene after Zeus, disguised as her own husband Amphitryon, visited her in secret, extending the night to 3 times its natural length in order to conceive a son of extraordinary strength. Hera's hatred for the child began before he had even drawn his first breath. Learning of Zeus's boastful declaration that a descendant of the hero Perseus, born that very day, would rule over all his kinsmen, Hera tricked Zeus into swearing an unbreakable oath confirming the promise, then rushed to delay Alcmene's labor while simultaneously accelerating the birth of another child, one born prematurely to a different woman entirely, a boy named Eurystheus, ensuring that this weaker child, rather than Heracles, would inherit the destined kingship. Even in infancy, Heracles displayed the strength that would define him, famously strangling 2 serpents that Hera sent slithering into his crib, an early sign of the extraordinary and often burdened life ahead of him. Heracles grew into a warrior of unmatched strength, married a princess named Megara, and for a time lived a life of relative peace. But Hera's fury had not diminished, and eventually she struck at him in the cruelest way imaginable, inflicting a fit of divine madness that caused Heracles, in a state beyond his own control, to kill his own wife and children, believing them in his frenzy to be enemies. When the madness lifted and Heracles understood what he had done, his grief was described as nearly unbearable, and it was this grief that sent him to the oracle at Delphi seeking a path toward atonement. The oracle instructed him to serve King Eurystheus, that same cousin whose birth Hera had once accelerated to steal his birthright, and to complete whatever labors the king demanded of him. What followed became the most famous sequence of heroic trials in all of Greek mythology, the 12 Labors of Heracles. He was sent first to slay the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide could not be pierced by any weapon, and Heracles ultimately strangled the creature with his bare hands, afterward wearing its impenetrable skin as armor for the rest of his life. Next came the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent with many heads that regrew 2 for every one severed, a challenge Heracles overcame only with the help of his nephew, who cauterized each stump with fire the instant a head was cut away, preventing regrowth long enough for Heracles to finally destroy the immortal central head and bury it beneath a heavy stone. He captured the Cyrenian hind, a deer sacred to Artemis, pursuing it for an entire year before finally taking it without harming it. He trapped the ferocious Erymanthian boar, and along the journey encountered and, in a moment of tragic accident, mortally wounded the wise centaur Chiron with a poisoned arrow meant for another target entirely, a grief Heracles would carry for the rest of his life. He cleaned the Augean stables, a task designed to humiliate him through sheer filth and drudgery, by diverting 2 entire rivers through the yard in a single day. He drove away the monstrous Stymphalian birds, whose bronze feathers could be launched like arrows, using a rattle gifted by Athena to flush them from hiding before shooting them down. He captured the Cretan bull, tamed the man-eating mares of Dionysus, retrieved the girdle of the Amazon queen Hippolyta, herded the cattle of the 3-bodied giant Geryon from a distant island at the edge of the world, and stole the golden apples of the Hesperides, a task so difficult that Heracles briefly took on the burden of holding up the sky itself while tricking Atlas into retrieving the apples on his behalf. The 12th and final labor sent him deeper than any hero had gone before, into the underworld itself, tasked with capturing the three-headed hound Cerberus and bringing him, if only briefly, into the world of the living. Heracles succeeded, using nothing but his bare strength and the protection of his lion skin. And it was during this same journey into the underworld that he came upon Prometheus, still bound and suffering after all those centuries, and finally freed him, fulfilling an old prophecy that had promised the Titans release only at the hands of a mortal hero descended from Zeus himself. Heracles' labors eventually complete, his life continued through further trials and triumphs, ultimately ending in his own painful death after unknowingly being poisoned by a garment soaked in what he believed to be a love charm. As his mortal body burned upon a funeral pyre atop Mount Oda, Zeus intervened at last, lifting his suffering son up to Olympus and granting him true immortality, where he was finally reconciled with Hera and given Hebe, goddess of youth, as his wife, a final resolution to a life that had been shaped from its very first night by his father's desire and his stepmother's endless fury. A son whose violence even his father despised not every child born to Zeus, and Hera brought either parent much pride. Ares, god of war, embodied violence in its rawest and least disciplined form, delighting in bloodshed for its own sake, rather than the strategic, purposeful conduct of battle that his half-sister Athena represented. Homer's Iliad records Zeus himself declaring Ares the most hateful of all his children, a startling admission from a father who had, by that point in the mythology, already forgiven or overlooked far greater offenses among his other sons and daughters. Ares found little glory in the Trojan War despite fighting on the Trojan side, wounded at different points by both a mortal hero, Diomedes, guided by Athena's own hand, and by Athena herself, who struck him down with a boulder to the neck, sending him howling back to Olympus in a display of pain and humiliation that must have tested even Zeus's patience with his most quarrelsome son. Yet for all his flaws, Ares remained useful to Zeus's larger order, a necessary embodiment of the violence that war itself required. A reminder that not every force the king of the gods presided over needed to be noble in order to serve a purpose within the balance of the cosmos. Into the kingdom of the dead, not every part of this story belongs to the bright world above the clouds. Beneath the earth, far from Olympus, lay a realm ruled by Zeus's own brother Hades, a place the living rarely entered and almost never left again. The underworld was not a single location, but a vast landscape divided by rivers whose names alone carried dread, the Styx, upon which even the gods swore their most unbreakable oaths, the Acheron, the river of woe across which the ferryman Charon carried the souls of the dead, provided they had been properly buried and carried a coin for passage. Those who died without proper burial were said to wander the near shore for 100 years, unable to cross, caught eternally between two worlds. At the gate stood Cerberus, the three-headed hound born to Typhon and the monstrous Echidna, guarding the entrance not to keep the living out, but to ensure that the dead could never leave. Beyond him lay the fields of Asphodel, a gray and quiet meadow where most ordinary souls drifted in dim, half-remembered existence. Further still lay Tartarus, reserved for those who had committed the gravest offenses against gods or nature itself. And for the truly blessed, there existed Elysium, and beyond it the Isles of the Blessed, reserved for heroes and the exceptionally virtuous, a paradise of eternal spring. Among the shades confined within Tartarus was Sisyphus, a king so cunning during his mortal life that he had managed to cheat death itself not once but twice, at one point even chaining the god of death, Thanatos, in his own home, so that no mortal anywhere could die until Ares finally intervened and freed him. When Sisyphus's own time finally came, he instructed his wife beforehand not to perform the proper burial rites, and once in the underworld, he convinced Persephone to allow him a brief return to the world above to punish her for this apparent neglect, an act of deception so audacious that, when he simply refused to return afterward, the gods were forced to send Hermes himself to physically drag him back down. For a lifetime spent trying to outwit death, Zeus decreed a punishment perfectly suited to Sisyphus's own restless cunning, condemning him to roll an enormous boulder up a steep hill for all eternity, only to watch it roll back down again each time he neared the top, an endless labor with no possible completion, forever close to success, and forever denied it. Nearby stood Ixion, bound eternally to a wheel of fire that spun without ever stopping, a punishment reserved for one of the earliest mortals ever invited to dine among the gods, an honor he repaid by attempting to seduce Hera herself. Zeus, testing the truth of the accusation, shaped a cloud into Hera's likeness, and when Ixion attempted to force himself upon the illusion, believing it to be the queen of Olympus, his guilt was proven beyond any doubt, and Zeus bound him to the burning, ever-turning wheel as punishment for a betrayal of hospitality and respect that struck at the very heart of the sacred trust between gods and the mortals they occasionally welcomed among themselves. Even the strange cloud Ixion had embraced was said to bear consequence, giving rise to a race of creatures called the Centaurs, half man and half horse, born from that false and troubled union. Alongside Sisyphus and Ixion labored the 50 daughters of a king named Danaus, a descendant, through many generations, of Io herself, whose long wandering exile after being cursed by Hera had ended in Egypt, where her bloodline eventually flourished and generations later split into 2 rival branches, one led by Danaus and the other by his own brother. Forced into marriage with their 50 cousins against their will, all but one of the daughters, on their father's own instruction, murdered their new husbands on their wedding night, a mass betrayal of the sacred bond of marriage that earned every one of them, save the single sister who had shown mercy, an eternal punishment in Tartarus. They were condemned to spend forever carrying water in jars riddled with holes, endlessly filling vessels that could never hold what was poured into them, laboring eternally toward a task that could never once be completed, another punishment shaped precisely to mirror the crime that had earned it. It was Minos, that same king of Crete whose obsession with a magnificent white bull had once brought the Minotaur into the world, who was granted, after his own death, a very different role within the underworld, appointed by Zeus, according to some traditions in recognition of the wisdom and fairness he had shown in life, to sit as one of 3 judges determining the fate of the newly dead. He was joined in this solemn duty by Rhadamanthys, another son born of Zeus and Europa during that same union that had produced Minos, renowned throughout his own life for unwavering justice, and by Aeacus, the gentle king of the ant-born Myrmidons, whose piety had once impressed even the gods themselves. Together, these 3 sons and grandsons of Zeus's own scattered affairs sat in judgment over every soul that crossed the river Styx, deciding who among the dead deserved the quiet gray fields of Asphodel, who had earned the eternal torment of Tartarus, and who, through extraordinary virtue, might finally be permitted to rest among the blossoming meadows of Elysium. Hades himself ruled this realm not as a villain in most tellings, but as a stern and largely fair administrator of the dead, alongside his wife Persephone, daughter of Demeter, whom he had abducted to be his queen, an act that led Demeter in her grief to withdraw her blessing from the earth entirely, causing the world's first winter. Zeus, forced to intervene as the fields of mortals lay barren and starving, brokered a compromise. Because Persephone had eaten a handful of pomegranate seeds while in the underworld, binding her partially to that realm, she would spend part of each year below with Hades, and part of each year above with her mother, an arrangement the Greeks used to explain the changing of the seasons themselves, the earth blooming each time she returned, and falling silent each time she descended once more. It was into this same shadowed realm that the musician Orpheus once ventured, seeking to reclaim his wife Eurydice after her sudden death from a serpent's bite. His music was said to be so beautiful that it charmed Cerberus into stillness, softened even the stony hearts of the Furies, and moved Hades and Persephone themselves to grant an almost unheard of exception, permission for Eurydice to follow him back to the world of the living, on one single condition, that he must not look back at her until they had both fully returned to the sunlight above. Orpheus, in a moment of doubt just steps from the surface, could not resist glancing behind him, and Eurydice was pulled back into the darkness forever, a story the Greeks told not as a tale of failure, but as a meditation on grief, longing, and the impossible weight of trust under the shadow of death. The judgment that doomed a city among the many consequences that rippled outward from Zeus's own choices. None proved more far-reaching than a wedding banquet held for the mortal hero Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, a union Zeus himself had once desired to pursue, until a prophecy warned that any son born to Thetis would grow to surpass his own father in power. A warning Zeus, remembering his own family's long and violent history, chose not to ignore. At the wedding, every god and goddess was invited except one, Eris, the goddess of discord, who arrived uninvited regardless and cast among the guests a golden apple inscribed simply with the words, "For the fairest." Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claimed the apple as their own, and rather than resolve the dispute himself and risk the eternal resentment of 2 of the 3 goddesses, Zeus wisely, or perhaps cautiously, deferred the judgment to a mortal, a Trojan prince named Paris, tending sheep on the slopes of Mount Ida, unaware that his choice was about to determine the fate of an entire civilization. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe. Hera promised power and kingship. Athena promised wisdom and victory in war. Aphrodite promised the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, and the beautiful woman she had in mind was Helen, already married to the Spartan king Menelaus. What followed was the abduction, or in some tellings the willing departure, of Helen to Troy, and the 10-year war that consumed the greatest generation of heroes Greece had ever produced, a war fought, ultimately, over a judgment Zeus himself had chosen not to make. 10 years beneath the walls, the war that followed drew in nearly every hero and demigod whose stories had, by then, already filled generations of Greek myth. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and heir to the same cursed bloodline that had once produced Tantalus and Atreus, led the combined Greek forces, while his brother Menelaus, Helen's own husband, fought alongside him seeking her return. Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, that same sea nymph Zeus had once desired before the prophecy warned him away from her, arrived as the greatest warrior among the Greeks, blessed with speed and strength beyond any other mortal, though bound by a fate he had long known and quietly accepted, that he would win eternal glory at Troy, but would never grow old to enjoy it. Zeus's involvement throughout the long siege was constant, though rarely simple. Homer describes him seated upon Olympus with a set of golden scales, weighing the fates of great warriors against one another before crucial battles, watching the balance tip to determine who among them was destined to survive the day, and who was not. A striking image of a god who did not so much control fate as observe and enforce it, bound by rules that predated even his own reign. He forbade the other gods from directly interfering in the war at certain points, only to permit it again, when it suited the larger balance he was attempting to maintain, favoring the Trojans at times to honor a promise made to Thetis regarding her son's wounded pride, and favoring the Greeks at other times when Hera and Athena, still resentful over the judgment of Paris years before, pressed him relentlessly on their behalf. The war's turning point came after Achilles, insulted by Agamemnon's seizure of a captive woman awarded to him as a prize of war, withdrew from the fighting entirely, allowing the Trojans, led by their great prince Hector, to push the Greek forces back toward their own ships. It was only after Achilles' closest companion, Patroclus, borrowed his armor and entered the battle in his place, only to be killed by Hector, that Achilles' grief transformed into an unstoppable fury. He returned to the battlefield, killed Hector in single combat before the walls of Troy, and in his rage dragged the fallen prince's body behind his chariot in full view of the grieving city, a desecration that even the gods considered excessive, prompting Zeus to eventually send Hermes to guide Hector's own father, the aged King Priam, safely into the Greek camp under cover of night to beg for his son's body back. A scene of raw grief and unexpected mercy that stands among the most powerful moments in the entire Homeric tradition. Achilles himself did not long outlive his enemy. According to later tradition, though not found within Homer's own surviving account, he was struck by an arrow, guided by Apollo and loosed by Paris, into the one vulnerable spot on his body, his heel, the single place his sea nymph mother had failed to protect, when she once dipped him into the river Styx as an infant, holding him by that very heel as she did so. A small oversight that fate had apparently been waiting patiently to exploit for an entire lifetime. The wooden horse and the fall of a city with Achilles gone and Hector already dead. The war ground on without a clear resolution until Odysseus, king of Ithaca and renowned throughout the Greek camp for his cunning rather than his brute strength, devised a final strategy. The Greeks would construct an enormous wooden horse, hollow inside and large enough to conceal a small group of their best warriors, then pretend to abandon the siege entirely, sailing their ships just out of sight beyond a nearby island while leaving the horse behind as an apparent offering to Athena. The Trojans, celebrating what they believed was the end of a decade of suffering, debated what to do with the strange gift left at their gates. A priest named Lycaon warned them urgently against bringing it inside the walls, famously declaring his distrust of Greek gifts, and was almost immediately killed, along with his 2 sons, by a pair of serpents that rose from the sea, a horror the Trojans interpreted, tragically, as a sign of the gods' anger at Lycaon's warning rather than a punishment for the deception about to unfold. Cassandra, daughter of Priam and a prophetess cursed by Apollo to see the truth clearly and never be believed by anyone who heard her, warned her own people with equal urgency, and was equally ignored, her curse ensuring that even the fall of her entire city could not make her words carry any weight. The horse was dragged inside the gates, and that night, while the city celebrated its apparent victory, the hidden Greek warriors climbed down and opened the gates to their returning army. Troy, which had withstood a decade of open siege, fell within a single night to a trick, its temples burned, its king killed at his own altar, its remaining royal family scattered into slavery or death, a devastating end that even some of the gods who had favored the Greek cause found themselves troubled by, as sacred spaces were violated and suppliants killed without mercy in the chaos of the sack. The long road home, the fall of Troy, did not bring peace to those who had won it. Several of the Greek commanders offended the gods so severely during the city's destruction, violating temples and slaughtering those who sought sanctuary within them, that their journeys home became punishments in their own right. Poseidon, already inclined to be difficult with sailors under the best of circumstances, turned his fury specifically upon Odysseus after the hero blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, extending what should have been a short voyage home into 10 more years of wandering, encounters with monsters, enchantresses, and the shades of the dead, before he finally returned to Ithaca, older, wiser, and having lost every single one of his men along the way. Agamemnon fared even worse. Returning home in triumph after 10 years at Troy, he was murdered almost immediately by his own wife Clytemnestra and her lover, partly in revenge for Agamemnon's earlier decision to sacrifice their daughter Iphigenia in order to secure favorable winds for the fleet's departure years before, a decision that had never been forgiven, and that finally arrived at its bloody conclusion the moment he stepped back through his own front door. It was left to his son Orestes, caught between the duty to avenge his father and the horror of killing his own mother to do it, to finally end, after generations of bloodshed stretching all the way back to Tantalus's terrible feast, the curse that had haunted his family since before his grandfather Atreus was even born. a resolution that later Athenian playwrights would stage as the very birth of civilized justice itself, replacing endless cycles of personal vengeance with the first courts of law. Established, fittingly, under Athena's own direct guidance. Zeus's role in the war's aftermath, remembered mostly through fragments and later summary rather than surviving epic, is often described as one of quiet exhaustion, a god who had allowed the war to unfold according to fate and prophecy, who had wept for his son Sarpedon, and yet let him fall regardless, and who now watched an entire generation of heroes, some the direct grandchildren of his own scattered affairs across the mortal world, disperse into death, wandering exile, or uneasy homecoming. The age of heroes finally spending the last of its strength in the ashes of a single burned city on the coast of Asia Minor. Zeus's role throughout the Trojan War, as later recounted by Homer, was complex and often reluctant. He balanced the pleas of goddesses on opposing sides, weighed the fates of great heroes on his own golden scales, and, according to some later traditions preserved in the lost epic known as the Cypria, had originally set the entire war into motion as a deliberate solution to an overcrowded earth, groaning under the weight of too many mortals, a devastating decision that echoed, in its own quiet way, the same flood he had once sent to thin humanity's numbers generations before. The fading of an age by the time the walls of Troy finally fell, the great age of heroes that had produced Heracles, Perseus, Theseus, and so many others was already drawing to its close. The heroes who survived the war scattered across the Mediterranean, some finding their way home only after years of additional suffering, others never returning at all. The demigods who had once walked freely between the mortal world and Olympus grew fewer with each passing generation, until the age of direct divine intervention in human affairs began, slowly, to recede into memory and legend. Zeus remained, as he always had, upon his throne on Olympus, but the world beneath him was changing. The Iron Age Hesiod had once described, an age of labor, hardship, and diminished wonder, had fully arrived. Fewer heroes rose to challenge monsters. Fewer mortals claimed direct descent from the king of the gods himself. The stories that had once been living religion, told and retold at altars and festivals across Greece, slowly began the long transformation into the myths we now recognize, tales preserved not through worship, but through poetry, art, and memory. What remains Zeus never truly disappeared. His name lives on in the language of astronomy, in the largest planet of our solar system, named for the Roman equivalent of the very god who once hurled thunderbolts across an ancient sky. His myths survive in museums, carved into marble and painted onto pottery thousands of years old, in the ruins of temples still standing, weathered but unmistakable, across Greece and beyond. His stories survive in literature, retold by poets and playwrights across every century since Homer first sang of Troy, reinterpreted again and again by each new generation trying to understand power, justice, desire, and consequence through the same ancient lens. Consider what actually happened to the physical worship of this god. At Olympia, where athletes once competed every 4 years in games held explicitly in his honor, where a gold and ivory statue of Zeus enthroned, crafted by the sculptor Phidias, stood so magnificent that ancient writers listed it among the 7 wonders of the world. There is now only a field of scattered stone, columns lying broken in the grass where earthquakes and the slow passage of centuries eventually brought them down. The great statue itself, moved at some point to Constantinople, was lost entirely, likely destroyed in a fire, so that no one living today has ever laid eyes on the image that an entire ancient civilization once considered their clearest glimpse of the king of the gods. And yet the games held in his honor never fully vanished. They were revived in the modern era, stripped of their religious meaning, but carrying the same name, the same spirit of competition beneath the summer sun, an old tribute to Zeus quietly continuing under an entirely different understanding of the world. Consider, too, what happened to the family he presided over. Every god who once stood beside him on Olympus, Hera in her jealousy, Poseidon in his temper, Hades in his quiet authority over the dead, Athena in her wisdom, Apollo in his light, Aphrodite in her dangerous beauty. Each of them faded from active worship at roughly the same time, as the ancient religion that had sustained them for well over 1,000 years was gradually replaced by newer beliefs sweeping across the Mediterranean world. Temples that had stood for centuries were converted into churches, their statues removed or destroyed, their altars left cold for the first time since they were built. It is a strange kind of ending for gods who had once seemed as permanent and unshakable as the mountains they were said to inhabit, a reminder that even beings imagined as eternal depend, in the end, on mortals willing to keep believing in them. But belief and memory, it turns out, are not quite the same thing. The Titans remain bound beneath the earth in the version of the story we still tell. Prometheus's fire still burns in every hearth and forge. Pandora's hope, whatever it truly meant, still lingers somewhere just out of reach. Sisyphus still pushes his boulder in our language and our imagination whenever we describe a task that seems to have no possible end. Tantalus's name still describes any temptation held forever out of reach. Narcissus, Arachne, Echo, and dozens of other figures from these same interconnected stories have become permanent fixtures of the English language itself, used by people who have often never read a single ancient text, who simply inherited these words the way one inherits an old family story, worn smooth by generations of retelling, until the original details grow hazy, but the shape of the lesson remains. And somewhere, in the quiet space between thunder and lightning, between the wonder of a storm rolling in across an open field and the memory of an ancient king who once ruled from the clouds above, the story of Zeus continues, not because anyone still kneels before his altars, not because anyone today truly believes a bearded god sits enthroned above the actual clouds hurling bolts of lightning at those who displease him, but because some stories, once told well enough, simply refuse to be forgotten. They survive not as belief but as inheritance passed from one generation of storytellers to the next, changing slightly with each retelling, yet somehow remaining recognizably themselves across nearly 3,000 years. The gods have faded. The heroes are gone. The monsters have become legends, but the stories survived. And thousands of years later, we are still telling them,